so much for making time to be here. It's super fun to be working with folks in a corner of the state that is far away. It's great that we could all be together. And yeah, I'm really excited for this. Melissa's great and has so much information to share. Before we dive into that, I just wanted to introduce myself in the Montana Media Lab. I'm Mary. I'm the program manager here at the Media Lab, and the Montana Media Lab is an arm of the journalism school at the University of Montana, and we do outreach and education around journalism for all kinds of people. So we try to spread awareness about journalism to the public. We teach journalists new skills within the journalism world. And then professionals like you all who are interested in working with the media. And also we have this news literacy program for high schoolers where we go into schools and teach kids, how to find good news and then how to, make journalism themselves as well. So that's what we're doing. We'd love to see you in future workshops. And yeah, we're really excited to be able to partner with Park County Community Foundation today. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Melissa. She has a great introduction planned for you, and I'm just really excited to pass things over to her. You guys all got an email from me, I think yesterday, about this practice interview component, and that's when you'll see me again. Don't worry about any of that now. Melissa's going to talk you through kind of this information, and then I'll walk you through the practice interview portion. So looking forward to going along on this ride with you, and right over to you, Melissa.
All right, Mary, thank you so much, and to the Montana Media Lab for having me be a part of this and share with you my experience. And thank you to the Park County Community Foundation for having me here today. I'm very excited to do this and to have you all here. Let's see if my computer is not always very cooperative, so hopefully you'll forgive any of my hiccups here with the technology as we go. I wanted to start off by telling you all a little bit about myself. So I graduated from the University of Montana in 1998 with a BA in broadcast journalism, and then several years later came back in 2010, got my master's in interdisciplinary studies with an emphasis on journalism and sociology. I spent 20 years, better part of 20 years working in broadcasting in television news, mostly as a reporter, an anchor, a producer. I was news director for a short time as well. And then also took some time to be away from TV on the radio, where I was a morning radio show host for a local station here in Helena. So that was quite an adventure in broadcasting. Most recently, I served as the community outreach coordinator for the Montana History Foundation, which is a 501c3 nonprofit that's based here in Helena. And some of you might have heard of them, but they fundraise and then turn around and distribute grants statewide for various types of historic preservation projects. And recently left them in the fall and started my own business, which is called Sapphire Communications, where I'm looking to help businesses and nonprofits like you guys to tell their stories. So I'm thrilled to be here. That's a picture of my beautiful family there. I have 3 boys, 16, 11, and 9, and my husband, David. So I had to show them off as well. And I want to apologize if I have to stop and catch my breath, which I'm going to do even now. But I recently had COVID a couple weeks ago, and I was very mild. I'm doing really well, but I have a little bit of a tickle in my throat. So I have a humidifier over here that's shedding me with moisture. And now I have seasonal allergies on top of it. So, I am more than happy, I guess, that this is over Zoom. So you guys can bear with me through all of that. All right, so let's start off talking about sort of the order of operations here and the topics that we're going to talk about. So first, we'll talk about making that first contact and how you go about doing that, and finding who you're going to reach out to. Talk about finding your story and some of the various sort of tactics or ways that you can go about narrowing down what that story might be. We'll talk about sending a press release, which a lot of you are probably already familiar with, but we'll go over some of the basics of that. We're going to talk about what happens inside the newsroom. So there's some things that are helpful for you to know when you're considering reaching out and having somebody come out and do a story with you. So there's just some kind of little idiosyncrasies that go along with newsrooms that I'll talk about. We'll talk about being interviewed and sort of what that is like, what sort of extras you might be asked to provide, or things that you can give or share that are helpful to really create a fuller story. And then there's a little asterisk. That's when we're going to break out and do the practice interviews for about half an hour or so. When we rejoin, we're going to talk a little bit about how that experience went, what you guys thought about being interviewed, what kinds of questions you might have after that process. And then we'll talk about what comes next if you have had a story done, or just kind of zip back and bring that back around full circle to what comes next if you've worked with the media, how you can follow up, and then any final thoughts or questions that you guys might have. All right, let's talk about making that first contact and things that you want to consider. So this is where I kind of broke it down into 3 ways that you might go about doing that. So the first thing is, maybe you just want to make a connection with somebody. You don't necessarily want any media coverage, but you want to make a connection for further down the road. That's one way that you can approach it. You could also say that you just want to help your community and your residents get to know more about you. Or you have a specific story to tell. There's something specific to your organization that you would like to share, and then you want to reach out and get some coverage for that. So we'll dive into each of those segments a little bit more here in a few minutes. But first, we'll talk about the types of media. So locating who is that media organization in your area that you would reach out to. So of course, there's a newspaper, and there you would be talking to the publisher, the editor, a reporter, and finding their contact information. Television stations, same thing, newsroom, a news director, the reporter. A lot of people think when we get to TV stations, they think, well, I'm in a smaller community. I don't think I would contact the TV station. They're 2 hours away. And I want to emphasize the importance of not having that mindset. The television stations want to feel regional, especially here in Montana. They want to be able to come to our smaller communities and include that. I mean, it's a real, if you're in Billings, if you're in Kalispell, if you're in Helena, if you're in Missoula, there's a real regional feel to that. And the TV stations want to be able to include those smaller communities. So never hesitate to reach out, even if it's a 2-hour drive for someone to get there. I tell you, if you've got a good story, they're going to come to you. So don't bypass that by any means. Radio stations, the same thing. Obviously, you have your local radio station, but we also have some statewide radio stations that you would want to consider. There's online newspapers and bloggers, and I suppose now maybe that's outdated. Maybe social media influencers are maybe more the tactic there than bloggers. But of course, those are just individual people who might have a big outreach that you would want to tell your story to as well. And then feature magazines. We have a lot of feature magazines across Montana. And so that's another outlook to consider, because you may have a specific story that really fits in with one of those statewide or regional magazines. Take a little sip of coffee here.
Melissa, Barb wrote in the chat that the Wake Up Montana and Yellowstone Public Radio are 2 spots that have shown interest in covering Park County. So
awesome. Yes, that's exactly right. Yes. So Yellowstone Public Radio is a great one. They have a lot of feature reporting that they do there. And yes, Wake Up Montana too. And a lot of the, more and more previously years ago, MTN, so the Montana Television Network, was affiliated with the CBS stations across the state, and then also has another NBC here in Helena. Those that have that statewide reach, that really have kind of a broad stroke that they paint with the stories, love stories from all over. So they've often have somebody that's closer to you than you think they are, that can do a story and love to do that. So here are some resources. If you're looking for some more specific information, to your area. So I'm going to go through each of these, starting with the Montana Broadcasters Association. So that's mtbroadcasters.org. And what I did was just took some little screenshots of what their websites look like in here. So you'll see on the left, it breaks down for radio and television. So if you want to reach out to just radio, you could click on that, and then it would list all of those radio stations in Montana. And then you could also just break that down by city, or you could just break it down by city and get all of the radio and television. And so in this instance, I'm showing you the TV stations for Billings, and it'll have their contact information on here, which is a great place to start. But I want to make sure to share that there's often a lot of turnover in newspapers, in radio and television. And so take this as a starting point, as a grain of salt. Because what happens is, you know, even within their own ranks on their own websites, they're not always very quick about updating, let alone a second party's website. So this is a good starting point. But there where you see the main email, they've got a couple individual names in there, and you probably want to reach out and make sure that whoever you're sending to is the best address. And usually that's going to be either a news director or at least the main email account. And so it's kind of the same thing with Montana Newspaper Association, mtnewspapers.com. Theirs isn't quite filtered out as nicely, but if you're just looking for something in a particular region, again, it's a good resource for you to go to and sort of see what's in your area. And then this is a list of magazines in Montana. And I put this list together a couple of years ago and went through it recently and just made sure that everything that was on this list is still something that's publishing. And all of these were still publishing when I last looked. And so most of these you could just plug in into Google and get to their website pretty easily. But it's interesting to see how many of them there are. There's a lot of them, and a lot of different topics, different specialties, different regions, things that you could use. You know, again, these folks are all going to be looking for stories, and yours just might fit in really nicely with one of these areas or one of these specialties. All right, I'm going to move on to the next section here, but is there any questions before I do that? Catching my breath. No,
Actually,
okay.
I have a question.
Sure.
Is there any easy way to determine what kind of readership or how many people are, on average, see each of the different types of media organizations?
You know, I'm sure there are specific to each kind. I'm sure they have a lot of demographic information for them. You know, a lot has changed with television in the last couple of years. And so I'm not very well schooled on that, because some of the ways that we used to gauge our viewership is not how they do it anymore. You know, back in the day, people used to get the little booklet in the mail to write down what they were watching on TV, and then they'd get like $1 in the mail, and then they'd send it back. And there are various ways that they used to do that. And I know that that has changed a lot. And I think in particular for television, because of streaming, I'm sure there's a lot of different ways that they do that now. And I would imagine that they can share some of that information with you per whether it's a magazine or a newspaper or a TV station, to kind of give you an idea of who sees it. But more than that, it's probably just what their reach is in terms of the size, where their newspapers go or where their readers are mostly located. I'm not sure how much more specific they get than that. Does that answer that?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, you bet.
Melissa, I know that you're going to be giving us a copy of the video, but is it possible to get hard copies of these things, PDFs, sent to us?
Absolutely. You betcha. Yep, I'll make sure that I get that to Mary.
Yeah, I'll send out a copy of this whole PowerPoint presentation, so you'll have the full document.
All right, so next, let's talk about finding your story. We're going to narrow it down into those three segments that I talked about earlier. So that's making an introduction, that the organization itself is the story, or that there's a specific story to tell. So let's start with making an introduction. You know, the first contact does not have to be a story at all. Really, it could just be as simple as calling up and being like, hey, I'm so-and-so, and I'm with this organization. Do you have a reporter, or is there a news director or an editor that I could talk to? I just want to tell you guys more about us. Invite them to visit. Let them know who you are. And when you have a story to share, then that connection has already been made. You've already crossed that bridge. And they'll also know who you are. And on a rainy day, if they're looking for something, or if they've sort of been mulling over it that whole time, they may just call you up and be like, hey, I'd love to come out and do a story. So, I mean, the thing is, reporters are always looking to make new connections, no matter where they're from. But I think especially here in Montana, because as we'll talk about later on, a lot of reporters, this is their first job. They want to know everything that they can about the communities that they're in. So they're super interested in making those connections. So the second one is the organization. Your organization itself is the story. So what is your organization's history? How did it start? Mission. How do you impact your community? How could residents or visitors become more involved? You know, I always think back, like if I was to be in the grocery store, if I'm walking down the street, and like say when I was with the History Foundation, if I said, do you know who the Montana History Foundation is or what we do? You know, what would the sense be? How many of those people would know? And so you kind of think about that with your own. And in smaller communities, I'm sure that maybe it's a wider reach because you're more visible within smaller communities. For the History Foundation, sometimes it was a challenge because although we were in Helena, we worked with people statewide. So getting that message out, it was a big, wide reach. But within that, it was the job of going into these smaller areas where the projects were being funded and making sure that people were aware of what we did and who we were. So there's a lot of different things that you can do there. All right, I'm gonna escape here. I'm gonna show you guys a story to give you a little bit of background on this. I had made connections with the Department of Administration, and this story is from 2016. It feels like a long time ago. But I had done other stories related to the Capitol, the building and the grounds. And one day I was bored. I didn't have anything else going on. And I enjoyed working with these people. They were really, really helpful and really fun. And I just said, hey, do you ever take people inside the dome? Is that something that you would ever do? And they said, yeah, we'll do that. And so this is the story from that day. So I'm going to play this here, and hopefully we don't have any problems.
The climb to the dome of Montana's capital is a dark one at times, measuring 60 feet from where you begin to where you end up.
Over about 87 steps in a 3-foot radius. And so, I mean, your spiral staircase is very tight, very narrow, and it's a significant climb to get up into here.
As you carefully ascend that narrow climb, you pass things that look familiar from the inside of the building, like the yellow glass panels. You see the dust of age and imagine the hard labor that must have gone into creating this metal piece of art.
There's been no major improvements to the outside facade of the building. There's been numerous renovations over the years. However, it's always maintained its integrity. It's a beautiful piece of architecture.
The biggest misconception that visitors might have when they come visit the state capitol is that the dome stops at the stained glass. In fact, it goes another 30 feet or more up to the top.
And what they don't realize is above that 92 feet they're looking at, it's another 35 feet of additional dome space up here.
While this space in its enormity is inspiring, it's the views through these porthole-like windows that offer you a peek into Helena's most beautiful landmarks. It's almost as if they were intentionally placed to refocus your attention to the outside.
But it does have some of the most beautiful scenery that the Capitol has. A lot of the windows give you a great 360-degree view of town. Generally looking across the valley, it's having a great view of the Sleeping Giant, having a great view of Carroll College, the cathedral. There's a lot of beautiful landmarks here in Helena that you really appreciate when you're standing up here looking out the windows.
All contained within the People's Landmark, Montana's state capitol. In Helena, Melissa Jensen, MTN News.
All right. Excuse me. So that was just
The climb to the dome of Montana's capital is a dark one at times,
gonna try and
measuring
replay
60
that
feet
here.
from where you begin to where you end up.
Come on.
Over about
Sorry,
87
guys.
steps in a 3-foot radius. And so, I mean, your spiral.
Okay. So anyways, that's just in my mind a really good example of, you know, a curiosity that I had about a thing. Obviously, in this case, it was the state capitol, but it had a wonderful story to tell. And then again, that was something with, as a reporter, that I had made those connections over the years, and it had I thought it was a really great story to tell. So, but what if it's not just a thing? It's not a big thing, an overarching thing. What if there is a more specific story to tell? So, did you get a grant to fund your work? Did you lose funding because of budget cuts? Maybe you're looking for new board members or volunteers. You have an exhibit opening. Are you holding an important fundraiser? Did you meet a fundraising goal? So there's all kinds of things that are specific, even aside from your mission, that might be of interest to your community. And so again, here is another example of this. And a sure sign of spring in Helena, if you've been to Helena, is that there's the Fort Benton, the Benton Avenue Cemetery is right on Benton Avenue there. It's a historic cemetery that we have here in town. And in the spring, they always have a sign that they hang up saying that there's a spring cleaning day, and they have volunteers come and help clean out all the debris from winter, knock down the weeds, and get everything cleaned up. And in this particular year, I drove this route every day to get to work. I noticed that no one was putting the sign up. And I thought that was really strange. And so I just Googled Benton Avenue Cemetery, and their website came up for their association. And I called the gentleman and I just said, "Hey, are you guys doing your spring cleanup this year?" And he says, "Well, I just don't have the manpower. I'm not getting volunteers to come do it." And he's like, "I've been doing this for a really long time, and I really am looking for new blood to come into this organization and help us out." And I said, "Okay, well, would you like to do a story with me?" And he was all for it. And so I'm going to share that story with you guys too, because this is a great example of sort of that specific story to tell.
Benton Avenue Cemetery Association President Tom Pearson has been with the group for more than 10 years. It was organized in the late 90s to rejuvenate the property after it had gone abandoned for 3 decades.
It was awful in '97 when this group got reorganized.
Pearson says, as always, there is plenty of work to be done.
We have many lilacs and trees to prune and get rid of the mess. Sometimes we do some mowing, we certainly do some weed whipping.
But there will not be a spring cleaning day this year.
When I went before the city and county in April asking for funds for this coming year, they asked me about the cleanup, and I said I just hadn't scheduled one yet because I hadn't even been able to get into the cemetery at the time.
The late melting isn't the only problem, though. So is manpower. Pearson says the board needs more people to be actively involved.
I need people who are willing to be officers, who are willing to be committee members, and I need workers.
Tom Pearson says he can't continue on as board president for much more than a year, and the board needs new leadership now to continue doing its work into the future.
We'll take any amount of time people will commit, but we do need some regular officers who are really willing to attend meetings, be available for consultation, and we will take anyone. I won't be able to continue, but I will stick around long enough to teach somebody if they'll just come down.
All right. So that's just a couple of examples from my time reporting, and I love that Benton Avenue Cemetery one. And later on, you know, I'll talk about following up and how, in this case, this story was perfectly planned out that I could come back later and do a follow up on this, and I don't believe I ever did. I'm sorry to tell you, but that will be a good way to explain to you all why you should reach out when you have a follow-up and make sure that that story continues to be told. So we'll talk about that a little later on. All right, we're getting ready to move on to the next section. Does anybody have any questions? I just want to make sure my pacing is okay. Am I going too fast? It's like we're all right. All right, I'm going to move on, but do tell me if I'm going too fast. I'm trying not to go too fast so that I don't pass out. But all right, so next, again, you guys probably have some experience with this, but I'm just going to go over how to put together a press release. And you know, there's a couple ways you could do it. One is you're typing in your email to send it off, and you just do everything all in one. Or you do a short little blurb in an email, and then you're attaching a press release separate. And as I talked about earlier, you know, reaching out and making that phone call so that you know who it's going to, you know it's going to get somewhere, and then also just sending it, you know, calling up later. Did you get it? Did it come to you? Do you have any questions for me? You know, those are all things that are okay to do. So following up to make sure that it gets where it needs to go is always a good idea. So here's an example of a press release that I sent out for the Montana History Teacher of the Year announcement back in 2020. The History Foundation has been a long-time supporter of this program. And it's put together, it's organized by a woman named Norma Ashby Smith. Some of you may be familiar with Norma. She's been around for a long time. She's a former broadcaster from a long time ago, and she's very involved in a lot of things across the state. But she has been the creator and supporter of this Montana History Teacher of the Year for many years. And so the History Foundation will put together the press release and send this out on behalf of her. So in this case, you know, you're formatting it with the date at the top. And in this case, this one was embargoed. I didn't want anybody releasing this information until this date. So that's the embargo up there. The contact information, as you can see here, in this case, it was not me. I was not the contact. I wanted them to reach out to Norma, and I did include my information too, and made myself available in the email if they needed anything from me. But because Norma is the voice and the face of this particular event and project, I wanted to make sure that if they needed something, that they talked to her as well. You've got your headline, and of course then the full body of the press release. You know, when you're writing a press release, what I found in my time as a community outreach coordinator was so different from what I experienced as a reporter. You know, as a reporter, my job was to go and get this and turn this into a story. But a lot of times, especially with some of our smaller papers, they'll run this as it's sent. So, you know, if you've got a story, you know, you just really want to make it so that you're formatting it and writing it as if somebody just copying it and pasting it and putting it in their paper, or utilizing it even for TV just to write it up, because that happens a lot in some cases with some stories. Obviously, the goal, if you want that to happen, you can state that in your email. But, you know, if you want somebody to come out, well, as we'll talk about here in a little bit, make sure that you make that clear to them, that you are inviting them to come interview you in person and get more. On the bottom there, you'll notice I put continues on this because it was a little bit longer. I'm sure that ideally making it a page or so, just like a resume, is probably ideal to keep it at a page. But this one was a little longer, so I want to make sure that they saw the rest. The second part of this was making sure that any links that I had for people to click through and get directly to further information if they needed it, ending it with the pound sign so that they know that's the end. And in this case, I added some more supplemental information on the teacher in case people wanted to include that. But it wasn't anything that I put in, you know, to the body of it, but it was definitely a little bit more biographical information on the teacher in this situation. So what happens then? Like I said, some newsrooms are going to go ahead and they're just going to copy and paste it, and they're going to run it word for word. I had that happen more times than I expected when I was at the History Foundation. And a lot of times, honestly, what people would do is they'd email me back and they'd say, you put this in a PDF. Can you put this in a Word document so I can copy and paste that? Which is totally fine. But it was interesting, just coming from a reporter's background, that, you know, a lot, especially in places where there's not a lot of manpower, They want to tell your story. They want to use that material, and maybe they just don't always have the manpower to send somebody out to get a little bit of extra. So again, they will just use that word for word. If you've got photographs, include that, attach those to the email. Make sure you tell them in there who to courtesy that photo. That'll be a question they have. In this case, I sent along the teacher's headshot and asked them to courtesy the History Foundation. And of course, one way that you can control how that happens, what happens with this, like I said, if you're fine with them running it, if it's just a little blurb, go for it. But if you are happy to be interviewed, if you have somebody that you on camera, make sure you mention that. So in this case, I ended that email with, we invite you to come and attend this ceremony. Please come and help us celebrate the teacher and interview her. We invited the media to come. And in your case, if it's not a specific event, you might just be inviting somebody to come, call you up and set a time to come do an interview and learn more about it. That's telling them that you have more information to share, you have more to show them on site. Even though you might not be comfortable with it, it's a missed opportunity to make that connection, of course. That interview will bring you closer to your audience. It's putting a face and a voice and more visuals to that story. And of course, we want that. And that leads to more exposure down the road. And who knows, of course, because of whatever your story is to tell, maybe it leads to more donations, maybe it leads to more volunteers, maybe it leads to new board members. And another thing is too, if it's not you that is feeling comfortable with being interviewed, you could highlight a board member, ask them to do the interview, volunteers, employees. It gives you a chance really to include others in that as well. More faces are always better than less. So reporters always want to have somebody that they can have on camera if they can. So your goal, this one is really important, I think. You obviously want the editor or the news director to read the email. You want them to at least get to that part. Reporters get hundreds of emails a week. They don't want so many of them. What happens is they end up getting on these mailing lists for all kinds of things. I mean, the amount of junk that's coming into their inbox is unbelievable. You want them to know that this is local content. Okay, that you are a local organization, that you're local people, and that this is a local story. That is the stuff that they're looking for. So you want them to read it, to know it's local, to consider running the story, or to contact you to do a story of their own, to do it more in depth. And this on the left is just a snapshot example of the story then that was done here by the local TV station for the Montana History Teacher of the Year. And of course, this is one of those examples, as I was talking about previously, the TV stations and how they're connected. Some of them, or we all know the newspaper, some of them are connected. A lot of times, here's a story. It was a Billings teacher. It happened in Helena. Helena covered the story, but it was a fantastic statewide story and it got picked up by everybody. And so that's great content that sometimes your story, it doesn't necessarily, it may feel local, it may be local, but it also may have some statewide interest too, because we all know that Montana is just one big small town, to be honest. And so it's amazing how far some of our content, some of our stories go that we are not expecting to take off. All right, so far you've decided what kind of story you want to tell, or if you just want to make that initial introduction. You've crafted your message and created your press release, made that contact, got the right emails, got the right phone numbers to make sure you know where you're sending it, and you sent it off. So that kind of brings us to almost a little full circle moment at this point. Any questions? I feel like I'm doing a really, really good job if nobody has questions. No. I'm going to take that as a pound back so far, you guys. But I know that's not the case, okay? So don't hesitate. Make sure you stop me if you've got something. All right. What's
Melissa,
up?
I'll ask a question. This is Barb.
Yeah. Hi.
If you send your pitch and you follow up and they put you off or they don't respond, like
Yeah.
how many times can you keep pushing? And even if they, like, at what point do you say, okay, they just haven't got my message, I'm just going to keep going to make sure they got it? And then even if they do give you a no,
Yeah.
is it okay to come back and negotiate? Or can you
That's a
just
great
speak to that?
question. That's a great question. I think there's a couple things to consider there. One is, you know, I always think that if you've got a relationship with a reporter, you know, that's going to help, you know, that's going to grease those wheels a little bit. But if you don't, you know, you want to start with the editor or the news director, whoever is in charge, because what they'll do is they'll either be like, this is a great story, I'm going to hand it to somebody and I'm going to be like, this is your story, go do it. Or they're going to bring it to a story meeting, and they're going to talk about it. And they'll be like, who wants this story? Does anybody want this story? And then they'll kind of put it up for grabs, right? And we'll talk about that here in a second. But the thing of it is, and that I can say about especially smaller communities, is that the time, and we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves, but we'll repeat this here in a second, that their manpower isn't always. So I feel like just because they couldn't do it doesn't mean they wouldn't do it. And so it is important to say, if they don't, call back and be like, hey, you know, we sent this to you and you didn't come. You know, was it a manpower thing, or is this just not something that you guys are interested in? And I think it's okay to do that. I think it's okay to ask them what's kind of going on, because sometimes it is as simple as they just didn't have the people to send. But I will say too, on the flip side of that, that making some of these phone calls ahead of time and making those contacts is sort of that greasing the wheels that you need anyways. Like, they're going to be like, okay, I talked to this person, I know more about this, they followed up. And you know, sometimes they just can't make it because, you know, breaking news happens and you just never know from day to day what's going to happen. So there's nothing wrong with that follow up and making sure that you're asking more than once. You know, what's the worst that can happen? They're like, they're gonna put your name on the wall, this person keeps calling. They won't do that. They eventually, you know, they just won't do that. They're happy to make those connections, and sometimes, like I said, asking, they may just tell you it just didn't work out that day. So hopefully that answered your question. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about this. This will be a little bit in points repetitive, but I think this is all good information to repeat over and over. So yeah, first point of contact, the editor of a newspaper or news director of the TV newsroom is often the first point of contact. They're making those content decisions. They're making assignments to reporters. But like I said, if you have a contact, go with it. Start with that person. And there were definitely times that I could tell you that somebody called me and said, I've got a story. And I would say, I wish I could do that, but I'm on vacation or I'm already tied up. I'm going to talk to the person across the cubicle from me, and I'm going to see if they would do this. And you know, so it's, you know, whatever your avenue is that you have, feel free to take that and make that connection and try and sell your story that way. Making contact earlier in the week. So reporters are always looking for a story on a Monday morning. I can tell you that. So they're coming off the weekend, they come in on Monday morning. And I would often, as the outreach coordinator, send my press releases on a Monday morning, because I knew that the news director was probably like, okay, everybody, like at a Monday morning meeting, what are you all coming with? And it was probably a bunch of blank stares unless something happened over the weekend. And so unless it's time sensitive, you know, earlier in the week is the better. They're going to have probably more manpower earlier in the week, and they're looking for stories. If it's an event, if it's time sensitive, try and make that 2 weeks or so in advance and get on the calendar. If it's on a weekend, you know, that can be good, and that can be bad. The good is that they're always looking for stories on the weekends. It's crickets out there on the weekends a lot of times. But the bad part is that they don't always have a lot of people. usually there's just one reporter, and that one reporter is probably covering 3 or 4 stories. So you've got kind of a double-edged sword there. It's probably, yeah, I can't say one way or the other, but it is definitely a good and a bad. As far as deadlines, of course, newspaper deadlines differ from TV deadlines. Newspapers are going to have deadlines later in the evening. And of course, weeklies differ from daily. So if you are working with a weekly paper and you have a time specific story to tell, that's really imperative that you have an understanding of what their deadlines are, because it would hate for you to have something happening on a Saturday and miss like a Tuesday print deadline, so keep that in mind, especially in those smaller communities working with the weeklies. TV reporters, if they're turning the story that day, which in your guys' case, they wouldn't necessarily, I would imagine a lot of your stories are going to be feature stories. The day-to-day grind, a lot of them will have to have their content in as early as 4 o'clock. If there's a 5 o'clock newscast, they've got to have their script done. And TV reporters, of course, we're not just going out and gathering information and coming back and writing it. You're shooting video. You've got to come back and download your video, log your sound bites, write your story, edit your video, upload your video. So you have all these other little things that go along. And so the earlier in the day that they can shoot something, the easier it is for them to turn it that day if it's something that's timely. But of course, a lot of our feature stories are more in-depth stories. We take a couple days to work on those. And that doesn't necessarily have to have as stringent of a deadline. So if you've got something going on in the evening, well, that's just a different kind of deadline. Then your deadline's, covering a story in the evening to put on a later show. So your deadline may be 9 o'clock if you have a 10 o'clock broadcast. And of course, like I said, newspaper reporters might have later deadlines, but all reporters are generally working on more than one story in a day, probably 2 or 3, to tell you the truth, unless it's a big story or unless they are hyper specific in their, if they're like a political reporter or something, they may have more leeway to do something, just one story that day. But for the most part, they're doing more than one story in a day. Holidays and seasons, here again, just like the weekends. Summer is generally slower. They're looking for more stories in the summer, and they're looking for stories over the holidays because they've got less manpower. There's less going on. But, same thing, double-edged sword. Less people to go around, less reporters to do the work, but more stories needed because it's quieter. So can work in your favor, can also work against you at times. All right, one final note on reporters. They might have grown up in your community, like I said, or they might have moved there yesterday. And I'm not even being at all joking. I moved to my first job on a Sunday, and I was covering a double house fire on Monday. So it is feet to the fire when they start. They could be from another country. I've worked with reporters that were from all over the country or all over the world. And in many cases, like we talked about, this could be their first job out of school. So kindness and understanding as they acclimate to a new job and a new community, they want to be a part of their community. And that's what makes the stories that you have to tell so incredibly valuable. They want to know more about what it is to be in Montana, to be in their area and their community and their region. But they might get lost on their way, and they might not have a cell signal, or they might have equipment issues, or they get a flat tire, or they forget a battery. So just making sure that if you do work, especially with a new reporter, just to understand that there's a lot going on there. And a lot of times they're as nervous as you are. They just want to do a good job, and they want to make you look the best that they can. So a little bit of kind of understanding in that regard goes a long way. All right, any questions on any of that? All right.
I had a quick question. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
So are there any generalities that you can offer in terms of, like, say you have an event that's happening on a Friday night, like how much in advance should you send that press release or that media contact a heads up?
I mean, I think the 2 weeks is a good time frame. But I think sending it, and then, like, if let's say it's on a Friday, you send it the week before, like on a Monday or Tuesday, and then you follow up the following week and just say, hey, I sent this press release last week. We've got this event coming up on Friday night. Do you think anybody will be able to come? I think it's always good to remind, because and everybody knows this in some capacity in their life. Usually it's in my life, I put it on the calendar, but it doesn't end up on my husband's calendar. And so he doesn't realize that something's going on, even though I put it on the calendar. Same kind of thing with newsrooms. We all have this in our lives in some capacity. The email comes in, but maybe the reporter or the news director didn't get it on the calendar. Or maybe they put it on the wrong date, or maybe they flaked altogether. So just that follow-up, like I said, it may feel to you like you're bothering or kind of badgering, but really, I just don't think that that's it at all. I think you don't have to feel bad about just making those quick little phone calls, because even if you're not talking to somebody, even if you're leaving a voicemail, even if it's a little follow-up email, it's just, there's so many different moving parts, so many people doing so many different things, that it's always best just to go that extra mile and check in with them. Thank you for your question. All right, let's move on to being interviewed. We'll get to the nitty-gritty here. So, looks like I already went too far in my pages. Okay, so being interviewed, always assume that there will be a camera and a microphone along the way. I cannot tell you how many times in 20 years of being a reporter that I would show up with a camera and people knew I was from the TV station, and they would still go, I didn't know you were going to bring a camera. And I just always thought that was the strangest thing, that they were not expecting that. I was like, well, I'm a TV reporter. Like, what was I going to come with? And I think especially nowadays, even newspapers are shooting video and putting various elements of that on their social media or on their websites. I think just always assuming that there is either going to be a professional grade camera or someone using their phone or a microphone. That's just something to always assume is going to happen. They might bring a still camera to get still photos. Someone recording a podcast may have their phone and a microphone. So just always assume that there will be a camera. Be camera ready. So the interview setup, and I'm just speaking to what I know about broadcast journalism, because that's my wheelhouse. That's what I know. So the reporter would arrive with their gear. They'd have a camera, a tripod, microphone, maybe some extra lighting. They're going to ask you for a good place to set up. So you could think about that ahead of time. Maybe you're in a specific place. Maybe your story involves something that's in the background, so you would already know. If you have an office, though, if you don't have a particular background in mind, blank walls and windows behind you are no-goes. That's a no. So try to avoid that if you can. Someplace that's that has some element of kind of quiet is always good. But just something that sets the scene is always really nice. During that initial setup, the reporter's probably going to be asking you some questions and just talking to you. And that's not without purpose. Okay, so I always think it's really uncomfortable when I'm setting up my gear and there's like silence, like there's no conversation happening. What I want as I'm doing that is I want you to feel comfortable with me. I want you to get to know me, and I want you to kind of hear how I interact with you and some of the questions that I might have. And I might start asking you things that I'm going to ask you when we're recording, because I want you to kind of start thinking about the things that I'm like my line of questioning and where I'm going. And so you may get repeat questions after we start recording, but that's okay. You've sort of started to formulate those answers in your mind, and that may be helpful to you too. But that in the beginning is a nice, relaxing, hopefully, just general getting to know you conversation. The reporter is going to interview you first. That's the first thing they're going to do, ideally, because I want to know from you, if I'm a TV reporter, I want to know what I need video of, because I'm going to show people and not tell them. So if you're talking about specific things, I'm going to make sure after we're done talking that I go get video of whatever that was that we were talking about. So they're going to get you set up wherever you've kind of come to the decision is a good place to be set up. They'll either give you a stick mic, which isn't as common, but give you the stick mic to hold kind of against your lapel, or they'll have a little lapel mic that you put on your shirt. And if at all possible, we try and hide the cord. This is like a really big pet peeve of mine, is when people don't hide the cord, the mic cord, because it's so distracting. And if you start to watch television news, it'll start to annoy you too. Just know that it's always nice if we can tuck it underneath your shirt, or tuck it in a sweater. It always looks nicer to have that mic cord hidden. They'll get you into a proper position. They'll get you where they want you to be, and then try not to move if possible. I mean, a little movement is fine. Don't lock your knees and like pass out or anything, but just try and know that a lot of times these folks are one-man banding. When I started my career, my first job in 1998, we had camera people, and most of the time I did not touch a lot of gear. Sometimes I did, but we had camera people for a while, and even in small market TV we did here in Montana, and that is just not a thing anymore. And there's very, very few. Maybe in Billings there's still a couple photographers, but it's just not very common anymore. So once they get you in position, they're going to focus in and make sure you're not out of focus. They're going to have that mic on you. They're going to ask you to count to 10 or say and spell your name. And I always went with say and spell your name, and then tell me what your title is. And a couple reasons to do that. One, because I'm using what you're saying to check my microphone level and make sure that my mic is working and that the level is appropriate. And secondly, I want that recorded because I want to get it right. If I go back and somebody's like, how do you say this person's name? And I didn't record that, and I don't remember, or I wasn't paying attention or whatever, because I was setting things up and I'm thinking about other things. I don't want to have to call you back and be like, can you tell me how to pronounce your name again? Like, that's not cool. So ideally, even if your name isn't difficult to pronounce, it's still nice to have it said, because it's just, like I said, for a couple reasons, checking the mic level and just to have it. And then that was always too, sometimes when people are nervous, they forget to hit record. And I'll tell you that I have done that before. When I first started, I forgot to hit record. But if I hit record before I did anything, then I knew that I was good and I didn't have to think about hitting record. I just had all of it from the very second I started talking to the very second I was done. And as I said, most people are one-man banding. So they're getting that camera shot, they're getting you focused, they're making sure the mic works. And then as we're talking, I'm gonna peek back every once in a while. If my little viewfinder's here, I'm gonna peek every once in a while and make sure that you haven't stepped out of frame. So just be aware of that if they're talking to you and they kind of lean back and they look, it's not because they're not paying attention or that they're being distracted or anything like that. They're just making sure that everything still looks good, because again, they're on their own. They're making sure that all these little checkpoints are being covered, and they don't want to come back and tell you that they messed any of that up and they have to do it again. Nobody wants to do an interview twice if they don't have to. All right, so I know this is probably the silliest thing that I'm going to say all day to you. But try and see it as a conversation. That's really, I know you're laughing at me. You think that that's really probably just silly, but try to see it as a conversation the best you can. Because it really is at its most basic. It's you're your conversation is with the reporter, but your conversation is with your audience too. And people always used to ask me, because you guys probably won't believe this either, but I'm an introverted person and I'm very shy. They'd be like, how do you do that? How do you anchor the news? And I'd be like, because I'm not anchoring to all the people watching. I'm anchoring to the camera. Like, I'm talking to the camera. There's nobody in here for me to look at. If all of you were standing in front of me right now, that would be a whole different story. I would be terrified. I'm not a public speaker, but kind of the same thing goes when you're being interviewed. You kind of have to just ignore what you think is on the other side of it and know that it's really just at its basic a conversation. And so they're recording this now, right? The first could be a dry run. We're having that initial conversation. I probably asked you some questions that I'm going to ask you again, but I might need clarification. Even once we start recording, I might ask you the same question twice. Why? Maybe I didn't get it the first time. Maybe you'll say it differently the second time. Maybe it'll come out clearer the second time. Maybe there was a motorcycle revving its engine in the background, and I need you to say it again because the perfect soundbite that you just said was interrupted by somebody with a motorcycle. And maybe you're going to ask to have that repeated because you're not happy with how it came out. And that's fine to be like, hey, that did not come out the way I wanted it to come out. Can I say that again? Is that okay? And they're going to be like, yeah, that's totally fine. And you can always ask to repeat it. Any questions on that? Does that make sense? I think that that's one thing I just wanted to leave you guys with, it, if nothing else here, is just, that sometimes interviews feel really strange and you'll be like, why did they ask me that? Like, that doesn't make any sense. But the reporter has no idea what pieces are going to make sense in the greater puzzle as it's all coming together. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you'll say something, or sometimes there's something that I know is on the press release that I can see it on black and white, but I want you to say it, or I want you to say it with emotion, or I want you to give me some context. So just know that everybody's interview style is going to be different. It may seem strange, but really it's just part of a process. And they're going to start sort of mentally putting together the story in their brain as they're talking to you. And so they'd be like, oh, I think I really need them to say something else, or this, or I want them to say something about this particular element because I know I'm going to want to get video of that later. I want to connect those dots. So just kind of know, I always felt like I didn't feel like I was the greatest interviewer, but and it's not always the smoothest that you want it to be, but like I said, just know that it's usually with some purpose there.
Hey, Melissa.
Yeah.
I have a quick question. This is Jessie. I was curious. I feel like I've been interviewed a handful of times and I have an issue with like my eyes going all over the room. Like, yeah. I'll look up, I'll look over, I'll look at the camera, and then so is there any tricks that you have as far as like trying to not be so weird with your eye? I feel like I'm always so weird with where I'm looking.
Yeah. And it feels weird, right? Because and I've had this, I know exactly what you're talking about. And I've had people do it in the past. And I even just did some interviews actually the last couple of days. I'm helping cover a convention for an organization, and I was doing little testimonials with some of their members. And, it's really just, I always say to them, just look right at me. Okay. Because a lot of times people, and you're probably not doing it if there's no like thought process there, right? You're just kind of by habit. Even when we're talking to each other, right, we're looking around, right? And so I think that the best advice is just to try, and even though sometimes it feels weird to maintain eye contact, just looking kind of in that same general direction at the reporter. Maybe looking around when you're in between questions or whatever sort of helps you kind of break that monotony. But knowing that when you're answering, when you're talking, to just talk to them. it was always interesting to me. Sometimes people could not stop themselves from looking at the camera, which was always so fascinating to me. So I was like, that's not really like, I couldn't do that. Like if I was being interviewed, I would think that would almost be more nerve-wracking than talking to the reporter. But yeah, I think if they don't tell you, like I always would say that, hey, just look at me and, you know, kind of ignore everything else. But I wish I had better advice for you, but that's probably about as good as I can get. All right, so once the reporter has finished asking their questions, they should ask you if there's anything that you would like to add. I, as a reporter, am not going to be able to ask every pertinent thing or know every little pertinent thing. And so you may get to the end and be like, oh, they didn't ask me this. I want to make sure that I mention that. And that's fine. So I don't know. That was always my MO. Got to the end. Is there anything else that you want to add, or anything I didn't think to ask you, is how I always ask that question. When we wrap up the interview, then that's when I'm going to get the video for my story for television. And I'm, like I said, want to get the video of the things that we talked about. And as a side note, later on, we'll talk about that may not be possible. Maybe you need to have things that you can prepare video of your own if you're talking about something that happened a long time ago, or pictures, still photos, whatever you have. So kind of keep that in your mind too as you're going. But I'll get the video that I can. I might still keep you mic'd up. If it's a wireless microphone, I always like to keep them mic'd up. And if they want to show me something, I'm going to take the camera with. I might take it off the tripod. I might put it on my shoulder and follow you around, or have you show me, or have you demonstrate something for me. And once all of that is done, I might want to do a stand-up. And you saw examples of the stand-up in both of those stories that I showed you. And this is always really challenging for me as an awkward human being, that I want to keep the person sort of in the vicinity in case I have questions, because sometimes, because I've got to write it, right? I've got to write on the fly. I've been thinking through my story. And if I'm going to do a stand-up, it's usually a bridge from one topic to another topic. And so I have to think and write something right there that I'm going to use 2 hours from now or whatever when I put my story together. Sometimes you get it right and sometimes you get it wrong, and you go back and you're like, well, I can't even use that stand-up. That doesn't even work in my story. But I'm probably going to try and do a stand-up if I can. And so sometimes what I would do is say, hey, I'm all done with you. I'm going to do a stand-up. If you need to get back to work, you can skedaddle and get out of here. But sometimes people didn't want to leave you alone either, depending on the scenario. I mean, every situation is going to be different, and they would still hover, which is fine. I mean, I was stuck in the Capitol Dome with my interview. He wasn't going to go back down. He was going to stay there to help me carry my gear down the windy staircase. So I always, just self-deprecating. I was like, okay, dude, like I'm going to probably do this 20 times and you're going to hate listening. Don't feel awkward. I feel awkward, but we got to get this stand up, because I think it's an important part of the story to show that you're there, you're involved, you're integrated into what's happening, and you're helping to kind of bridge those elements. So just know that that stand up is an element of the story that might come into play. All right. Well, I think we're moving along at quite a good clip. Mary, what do you think?
Yeah, no, this is great. We're going to transition to the practice interview section now, right, Melissa?
Yeah, if everybody's good, if nobody has any questions about anything at that point, I don't know if there's anything in the chat or anything that you guys need me to touch base on.
I have a quick question for you.
Sure.
Melissa, so I haven't done, when I've interacted with the media, it's typically through newspaper. And one of the things that I'm always so concerned about is the person taking the reporting, if they're getting it accurate.
Yeah.
And I think it seems to me that it's not ethical or not okay to preview the story before it's printed. There's always that unknown in the written interview, Could you speak to that just a little bit?
Yeah, I will say that that's one reason I went into broadcasting, because I was not good. And you could probably go back to my newspaper reporting teacher, and she'd probably tell you I was terrible at it. It's really hard, and I was always in awe of them because they seem to be able to keep up and write their notes and get the quotes. But you're right, it's difficult because in that regard, you do have to have a certain level of trust, right? You're trusting that person, especially if it's something that you really want to make sure that they're getting accurately. And no, like that's what's hard. Like I would never let anybody like approve my story or see it beforehand. Like you're right, that's just not something that happens. So yeah, I don't know. I guess I would just say if you feel like there's something specific that you've talked about, that you've given a quote on, that you want to make sure that they get right, just kind of be like, hey, did you get, ask them, did you need me to expand on that? Did you want me to repeat that at all? Or can I send you even something like after the fact to make sure that you've got it right? And later on here, after we do the practice interviews, I'm going to talk about the importance of making sure that if it's wrong, that you speak up and say something. And so we'll talk about that a little bit later on too. So that might be helpful to answer that question as well.
Yeah, I wanted to add, I've worked as a newspaper reporter, and something that, often people will ask, like, can I see this before it goes to print? Which, yeah, like you said, is not, just isn't a thing that journalists do. We don't want our sources to be able to dictate what we're writing, but it's totally fine to ask for like, could you read my quotes back to me? Or I'm like, this particular figure or this explanation is sometimes hard for people to understand. Can you call me up and read? I'm always happy to read over the phone, even, verbatim what I've written, not the whole story, but those like points of, those tender points, because, like journalists don't want to get those things wrong either. And I think that's a great way to collaborate, and, making yourself available to that. I think it can be hard. You're like, track this person down for an interview. You finally found the time when you could both be available. And then you're like, oh no, now I have to go back and call them again. And if you say like, hey, it's really important to me that we get these things right, I'd love to talk on the phone before you send this to your editor or before it goes to press, like that's great. And I think journalists want to hear that and would, want to hear that you're willing to take the time to help them get it right.
Absolutely. And I totally agree with that. I think that's spot on. Absolutely.
Yeah, so we're going to do our interview practice, which I'm going to talk to you about the nitty gritty of in a second. But before we do that, do you have any questions for Melissa that might help you do a great interview in this interview practice that we're about to partake in?
Can I ask a question first?
Sure.
So I work on a really sensitive topic, which is suicidality. Do you have any suggestions for how to help educate the press? Because I do not want our information sensationalized. There are very specific ways to talk about it that are less potentially trauma-inducing. And do you have any suggestions for how to handle that?
Yeah, I would say that's a great question. I would say the one thing is that, and especially nowadays, I feel like even more so now than ever, people want to be able to do that properly and with sensitivity. And so I think it's okay just in the interview process to be like, hey, here, can I share with you some ways that I'd love to have this reflected to ensure that we're being sensitive and that we're doing this in an appropriate way. So I just think it's part, the thing that I always told people that the reason why I got into journalism in the first place was because I'm just a curious person by nature. And I love knowing and finding out and learning about all different kinds of things. And I did feel at points in my career, I covered stories, and I know that as a young person, especially, that I probably didn't always do a great job. I wanted to, but you just can't know, right? And so part of that is the learning. Part of what we're doing as journalists is it's my job to communicate that to a wider audience, and I want them to be learning and being educated and doing just as much to kind of further that as I am. But if I can't do that well, if I can't do that with what you want to achieve, then that's not helpful, that's not useful. And so I think integrating that into the bigger conversation is awesome. It's great. Like I said, I know there were definitely times when I was a young reporter learning, and just as a human being, I was learning and made missteps along the way. But I cannot think of a time that I wasn't met with grace by the people that I was working with to help me to do that. I think there's only 2 instances where I walked away going, that was bad for everybody involved. So I don't know if that helps, or if Mary, if you have some thoughts on that, or if I've answered that. Hopefully I did. Mary, do you have any thoughts there?
Well, I was thinking, I think, Melissa, you were getting at as a source, as the person who's being interviewed, you should feel really welcome and invited to kind of coach the journalist you're working with on how to, you're the expert. This is just someone who covers a broad range of things. So if you have advice about this is the language that we use surrounding this topic, or I think you can say I would like there to be a content warning before this, or I think expressing your your expertise around communicating about the topic that you know about is great. And I think there's a line where you can't tell, journalists can't be told I want you to say this, this, and this to make me look good. Journalists don't want that, but they do want to communicate your issue properly. So it's so okay to say this is the language that we use, this is why, and your story would be better if you use this language. And I think that's great. And I would encourage you during this practice interview to maybe think a little bit about the ways you would start, go into the interview and say this is a sensitive subject. Here are some of the things that might happen if it's covered in a way that isn't appropriate. And here are a couple tips I have that could help you do a good job. I think that's a great thing to be ready with. And if I was reporting on a story and someone did that for me, I would be so thankful.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would definitely suggest you practice that during this practice interview too.
Thanks. Thank you for that question. That's a wonderful question.
Can I ask a question? So the work that we do at the Community Foundation is not as sensitive as what Janet does, but sometimes we do have complicated collaborations or kind of multi-phase projects. And you've given us a lot of great examples about how to hopefully create the conditions that we're getting the information out as clearly as possible to really kind of minimize the opportunities for mistakes. And we have sometimes had mistakes. Generally, they happen in areas where it never occurred to us that was unclear and we needed to be more clear, but then it gets misconstrued and you're like, now we know. We have been of a lot of different opinions as to what to do next. We cycle through, should we call the reporter? Should we write a letter to the editor? Our local paper does a lot of incredible local coverage, and they have really high turnover with reporters. Mm-hmm. So if it was a reporter who was, in town for the long term, I feel like we could, ask them out for a beer and kind of sort it out. It's a pretty steady churn. So I feel like just because we clarify it with one person doesn't mean that's necessarily going to get passed along. So I would be really interested to hear from either of you your thoughts on if something is inaccurate, what do you
Yeah.
What do you do to correct that? Does it cause more of a mess if you try to correct it? I don't know.
Yeah, no, great question. And I will talk a little bit more about that coming up, but I think, what you're saying about the turnover is exactly what I was alluding to earlier, and on different levels, right? But here in this situation, you're talking about, well, we've done this, we've had this conversation, and now we've got to keep having this conversation. So just knowing that you have to have that conversation and continuing to do that with new reporters, I think is important. But also, I think even when you get to the end of the interview, to say, hey, if you have questions about anything we talked about, call me. This is my cell phone number. I'm happy, like Mary said, I'm happy to reiterate. I'm happy to give you another quote or change whatever, or help you to write it. Because that's the thing too. You know, there were times when I would write stories. I tell you what, I was a reporter in Billings for several years during a highly complicated situation with the city manager. And I was literally eating, like acid was eating away the lining of my stomach, because I was terrified about making sure that I was writing what was being said properly and having the context right, having the wording right. I think that kind of goes back to the conversation we were just having about making sure that if there's something going on, that you're being clear and you're helping that individual to have a better understanding of how to write that story. And so making yourself available as they're writing it is key, because as they're writing it, they may go, oh my gosh, I forgot what this was, or how I need to say this, or how just nobody speaks your lingo except kind of those of you who are in that. Like, I can't be an expert on the lingo of all these different things. So getting that assistance, I think, is so crucial. And I think just making it so that you avail yourself to that person to call when they're in the process of writing it is huge. And then later on, we'll talk about, if it goes through and it doesn't come out the way that you expected it to, that you call and you talk to the reporter first and foremost, and that you don't email them, that you have that conversation. And again, it may go down the line, right? Like, there may be some disagreement about whether or not they wrote it the way, that it's not necessarily the way you want to, but it may need to go to a hierarchy, is kind of where I'm going with that. The news director or the editor may be involved in those conversations. Mary, is that kind of on track with how you would think that through?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think I'm sure Melissa is going to talk about how the corrections process works, but I think it's important for people to know, as a journalist who's worked with many other journalists, the worst feeling is, and your biggest fear, is getting that call or that email where someone's like, you got this completely wrong. And I don't think journalists are trying to do that, but it can totally happen. And I think if you see the relationship between you as a source and the journalist as this back and forth continuing relationship that involves you being available to them and them feeling comfortable following up with you, I think that's the best way to prevent those kinds of things. And I really do know that I am more likely to follow up with someone if they say I'm available, I would love to talk to you again. So I think just, making it known that that's something that you're willing to continue working with them on, and say, I love it when people say, you can send me a text and clear something up, because that's fast and, doesn't require so much work. So I think, like Melissa said, just keeping the relationship going.
Yep, sure.
Great. We're gonna take a little break in a second before we dive into practice interviews. Do we have any last questions before that? All right. Okay. Well, if you have questions that come up during our break, that's fine. We're going to combine a take care of yourself, run to the bathroom, get water break with a little break to come up with some questions for these practice interviews. So basically what's going to happen is you're going to get paired up with another participant here, and you're going to each get a chance to act as the journalist, the interviewer, and as the person being interviewed. And we'll record those interviews and then we'll send them to Melissa, and she'll give you feedback on, ways that you could have done a better job, been more clear, things like that.
Their thoughts on how the interviews went, or what they thought about being the person that's asking the questions?
I prefer to be asking the questions. I could do that all day long. Ask people questions about what they do.
So then in turn, when you were on the other side then being asked the questions, did you find it difficult or kind of scary, or were you fumbling?
Yeah, I do. And that I was telling Jesse that that's one of the reasons why I wanted to be a part of this, is because I feel myself really freezing up, and 14 years of knowledge about the organization that I work with just kind of goes poof.
And so, like, thinking through, if you were doing an interview with a reporter, like, what do you think could possibly make the difference in helping make you feel more comfortable?
Yeah, this was handy for me. I think kind of having an idea of what she was going to ask, because we were using those prompts that you provided. And when I have that opportunity, I really do kind of practice and make some notes for myself, and try to slow down and give myself the grace to stop and look at what I've prepared.
Absolutely. And, I think that's interesting to bring up as well, is the idea of knowing what the questions are ahead of time. I have had plenty of people ask me over the years, can you send me your list of questions? And I'll tell you that I very rarely ever did that. I never really wrote out a list of questions. Sometimes I did, to make sure that there were certain things that I absolutely positively wanted to ask, that I wouldn't forget to ask them. But most of the time, like I said before, trying to make it a conversation meant that I was crafting what I wanted to ask next based on the response to the question before. There were things that would come up. So to have a list of questions just was not always an easy thing to do, but there would definitely be times that if somebody asked for that, I'd say, okay, I know I want to ask you about this, this, and this, for sure. But yeah, it's challenging. It's nice to be able to formulate that stuff, or at least have some idea ahead of time. Anybody else have any thoughts or reflections on what this experience was like?
I suffered from Jesse Wilcox syndrome. Like, I knew I was like looking off to the side. I just saw it. Then Jesse's name kept popping in my head because she had said that earlier. Not picking on you, Jesse. You do great.
Oh, I did it too. And I knew I was doing it when I did it. And then I feel like I get into that casual mode. Like, Haley was my partner and she was super easy we chatted beforehand and then we ran out of time. So I'm sorry, Haley. Like, we ran out of time for yours, but I felt like I got into the, like my I felt like I was too long-winded, or I got too chatty. And then when I do chat, I do like, look around and my hands are doing things. So I feel like I was squirmy, maybe, I don't know.
There you go. And that's the thing we go to, right? Like, sometimes I find myself rocking, like when I had my babies, when I would rock them, I just said, like, do this back and forth. Just in normal conversation, I would find myself doing that sometimes, maybe if I'm feeling a little awkward or I'm talking to somebody new. And so absolutely, we all sort of fall back into those little kind of comfort patterns that we have, that we don't always even know that we're doing it, Did anybody have trouble continuing that flow of questions? I'm curious if you found yourselves, or if it just kind of flowed naturally, if you felt like you had enough to talk about. 10 minutes is a fair amount of time to talk.
Yeah, I think it felt like a long time, but the thing I kept thinking of as I was responding, I was thinking about sound bites, because they don't always take everything you say And so what is it that I really want to say that's important, that is memorable, that they will want to take away with, it's like, not only is it there the discomfort of just interviewing and, because it's such an unnatural environment for most of us, but then also like, what am I saying that's really important?
Absolutely. And sometimes it's almost like you probably feel like you could overthink that, right? Like you don't want it to be so predetermined that you're paying more attention to thinking through to make sure you say exactly what you planned out than to just having it be natural. I had a guy who asked me to hold up pieces of paper one time so he could read off exactly what he had written down. So he was really nervous and he was really wanting to make sure that everything that he said was exactly what he wanted to get across. And that can be a detriment too. I think it goes back to, oddly enough, something that you probably don't see a lot of, or I guess maybe I'm not honestly watching as much local news as I used to, but when a reporter does a live shot, when they're doing a live interview, or when I would be live at a scene reporting on something, it's kind of the same sort of tactic that you would use in that case as a reporter, where I knew exactly what I needed to say, but I would have bullet points and be like, okay, in my mind, I know I want to say, mention this, this, and this, and not try and script out every single word, because I knew that if I didn't allow myself the grace to just be conversational, that I was going to be paying too much attention to what I wanted to say and not just knowing, okay, I know I've got the other words. Let's just fill in the blanks with those important points and let the rest of it sort of become more natural. Anybody else have any thoughts or any questions or anything that you want to mention about the experience? Like Mary mentioned, I'll go through and I'll watch what you guys did, and I'll try and see if I can give you some pointers or some thoughts. But if you had any other any questions, make sure you let me know.
I have a comment.
Sure.
My one comment, just from sometimes working on the other side of the camera and actually trying to cut things together, is to not be afraid of empty space.
Yes.
Of like allowing yourself to just pause and collect your thoughts.
Yes.
Because the editor is always going to be looking for those points where they can cut back and forth from the dialogue. So I mean, my tendency when I first started doing this was to fill the space, to kind of talk all the time. And now it's like, I remember that it's okay to just pause and collect my thoughts and then speak.
Yeah. And you guys probably noticed, if you even go back and watch this recording, I myself was trying to do that as we went along, because silence feels so weird to all of us, especially if you're a person like me who has a tendency to fill that space. But you're right. The more you can kind of break that up and just kind of let that breathe for a second. And then you're right, it does help them with the editing process. It helps, I'm sure, the reporter, even a newspaper reporter, like we're talking about them taking quotes. They need the time to finish what they're writing to make sure they're getting what you said down. So even that break in silence and like allowing that to go helps out either way. And it helps for everybody involved, I think. All right, well, if that's all the thoughts you guys had for now, and you can, if you think of something else, make sure you interrupt, but we'll kind of continue with these last little bits here that I've got for you. So the question is now, what comes next at this point in time? After you've done the interview, they've shot all the video. There's a couple questions that you should be thinking about asking them. First and foremost is, when will this air, or when will this go to print? When can I expect to see this? Most of the time it will be kind of in that 24 to 48 hour window, but not always. Ask, will the story go online on their website? Will it go on their social media page so that you can share it to your organization's page? And of course, ask for their business card and make sure that you offer yours too. And as we were talking about, availing yourself to that reporter, so that if they get back and they start writing and they have questions, if you want them to text, say, hey, it's my cell phone number. Feel free to text me. Feel free to call me. I'd rather you call me and ask me questions than guess or go ahead without it and then have to go back and fix something or retract something.
I mean, one other thing to ask for, and you might cover this as you go forward, is to see if you can get a PDF of the story if it's in print, so that your organization can put it on the website.
Absolutely, because at the History Foundation, when I was doing that, I did find that was challenging, because sometimes if you are not, if you're not a subscriber to the paper, or it ends up somewhere else outside of your area, then you might not be able to access that.
Totally.
That's a really good point. All right, so what else can you provide? We did touch upon this a little bit. So are there websites with additional information that you can provide? Still photographs, video elements of your own that you can share, charts, graphs, or other supplemental information if you're talking about something that has numbers. And of course, this is something that should be talked about maybe earlier when you're first setting this up, but are there names of other people that you suggest to be interviewed as well? And once that story is released, make sure to give them a call, thank them for their interest in covering the story. And we talked a lot about this before, but I do want to just reiterate this. This is just so critically important. If there is an issue, if you have something that you're not pleased with how it came out, make sure you give them a call. And I say this because in my experience, I came across so many people who just wouldn't have anything to do with even talking to me. They just said, I've been burned. I've had a bad experience. I was mistreated in the past, and I'm not even going to give you a shot. I so much as got thrown out of a clothing store in Great Falls. And I had called, how bizarre is that? This is like 20 years ago. Went in to cover a story talking about like downtown businesses, and I walked in with the camera, and the owner yelled at me, threw me out the door, and I was like, holy guacamole, what the heck just happened? And my news director called, and it turns out this guy had just a really bad experience that had nothing to do with me. And it was really unfortunate that he was so disturbed by what his previous experience was. And I just don't ever want that to end up happening to you guys. So if something happens, make sure that you give them a call. Don't email, give a call. And like we talked about, if it was taken out of context, something was misstated, something was misinterpreted, something was written down wrong, there are absolutely things that can be done to correct. But what is really, really difficult to correct is that festering bad feeling. That is much more difficult to overcome. So nobody wants to. And I think Mary said this at one point too, like we want to do well, we want to do good by what we're there to tell the story. Most mistakes are absolutely innocent and they have no malice involved. So just keep that in mind. So when it comes to sharing your story on social media, of course, newsrooms will usually post their stories to their social media that day or the next 24 hours or so. Sharing their post to your own social media pages then allows your followers to see it and share it as well. And of course, if you don't have social media yet, now could be a good time to get it started and to get things going before you ever get to the point that you have a story to share through another organization. This will have you kind of getting that groundwork laid right now. Here's a couple examples just from my time at the History Foundation. So the two on the left were stories that we had the media come out and cover. So this is us sharing those stories, thanking the reporters for coming out. And then on the right there is a story we did on ourselves. So while I was at the History Foundation, we did something called History Road Trips. And I would go out and I would visit some of our grant recipients and talk to them just about what they did, who they were, and how a grant from the History Foundation had helped them. And so that was us sharing our own story ourselves, which is something if you have the capability to do, you should also consider doing that as well. I mean, it's always great to get that wider audience, but start thinking within your own mind, if you aren't already, of the things that you can share and create on your own. Same thing with the Instagram. I created little project profiles. So we would focus on a project, share in the middle there an employee that had joined our group. And then we also had exhibits that would go up. And so sharing again, we would have this was our Carnegie Library exhibit that went to the Carnegie libraries across the state. And I would work with the librarians to get the pictures and try and make sure that we were getting people in to see that exhibit and cross promoting that across our various forums. So I alluded to this one earlier, and we kind of talked a little bit too about just how many times you reach out and talk to somebody and try and get coverage. But let's say a reporter comes out and does the story. Is there follow-up? That's always something that you want to be thinking about. That Benton Avenue Cemetery story was a perfect example that if I had been sort of planning further down the road, I would have said to him, hey, let me know if you end up getting a new president, if you get new board members, if something changes with the cleanup day, and I'll come back and talk about who your new president is, or all, different aspects, or if there was further challenges to getting that cleanup done. So if the story was about a fundraiser, pitch a follow-up about how that fundraiser went. If the story was getting a grant, invite them back if there's work to be done or something to show them. If the story is about looking for new board members or new volunteers, pitch a story about the roles in those in your organization, or just even sending something to the business section of the newspaper to let them know that those people have joined your organization is another way to sort of simplify the process of making that connection. Hey, I've got this thing for your business section. Can you put this in there? Awesome, great. And then maybe they go, oh, I didn't even know that organization existed, or I think I might like to go ask them more about what it is that they do. And that can be another way to sort of build those bridges. All right, you guys, that is all that I have. That's kind of the end of the slides. Did anybody have any other questions that came up while we were going through those last bits?
Melissa, I was wondering if you could talk about, I guess in general, how outlets run corrections, and especially about TV. I don't know about that.
Yeah, so I don't have a lot of experience with it, but I know that there were times if there was something that needed to be corrected, then we would run sort of an element, like a piece of that story or a follow-up the next day or as soon as we could. And certainly it was always corrected online. That permanent record of the story would, and then, they usually will make a mention, this story originally, had a mistake, or this is the correction to that. I can tell you from my personal experience at the History Foundation that there were times that things were incorrect. And I'll tell you why. Oftentimes, the confusion with the History Foundation was that they thought we were the Historical Society. And that is not at all. There was an image issue that I was very strongly trying to overcome. As soon as you say Montana, people sort of finish it for you. So if we couldn't even say Montana History Foundation before they thought we were going to say Montana Historical Society. And no matter how many times I tried to make sure that error was not put in, our press releases would go out and inadvertently somebody would just make that mistake. So that was the most common correction that I myself, as a public relations outreach person, was trying to fix. And they especially, I don't think I ever saw the printed newspaper corrections, but definitely online. I know that there were efforts to go back in there and get that information put correctly. But yeah, absolutely. If there's something that's wrong, I think you have to reach out and say something. Don't let that sit and fester.
Yeah, and I in newspapers I've worked at, they have included in the following print edition, we apologize for the error, this is the correction. So if it's not correct, the outlet should be like making big efforts to correct it. And that should definitely happen online and will also often be included in some future edition of that.
Yeah, I think it's harder with TV. You know, and I think it's easier now because anything that needs to be corrected can be, but prior to the time that you know, the websites were kind of that record, going back online or on air and doing it was more challenging. But obviously if it was a significant error or something was misstated, then absolutely that would be corrected in a follow-up on the next available newscast. Any other thoughts or questions or anything I didn't cover? Or
yeah, I think we can open it up for any questions you have for Melissa about, you know, how you can get the word out about your organization or your event using the media. You should go for it. You have her here and she's such a great resource.
I have a question, Melissa. So a bunch of folks who had expressed interest in attending this are out of town this week. Some of the folks who signed up had things come up. Some people have gotten COVID and haven't been able to come. So I'm grateful for all the people who were able to be here this afternoon, but I know there is much larger interest in the community beyond just the people who are here on Zoom with us today. Is there like a, what am I trying to say? If you are trying to build your organization of folks who are savvy about media, is there something that you should be doing like once a year, you know, along with your strategic planning retreat, that you should all be getting together and getting out your iPhones and interviewing each other? Or, you know, I don't know, randomly dropping into your coworker's office and being like, pop quiz, I'm going to interview you right now. Like, are there, are there just sort of like I feel like I'm familiar with best practices in a lot of aspects of nonprofit administration, but not so much on this one in terms of how to prepare your staff, your board, your volunteers, so that if something comes up and you get the opportunity to be on TV or radio, that you can really maximize that opportunity.
Yeah,
So
well, I would start off by saying, I would say obviously continuing to stay connected with Mary and with Montana Media Lab is huge. That the offerings that they have been able to give and encouraging people to get on there and take part in those is, I think, really important. I think that I would just say, maybe as part of your annual planning, whatever point in time you sort of look ahead to the next year, is to sort of consider what happens throughout the year and pinpointing times when there could be something that's newsworthy within the organization, and just making that kind of part of your calendaring out that you're doing as you look, you know, again, at the History Foundation, we had certain times of the year. The grant program, you know, would go open in November. So we would announce that the grant cycle was opening, and then we would get around to the beginning of January, the grant cycle closes. Within a couple months, then those grantees have been chosen, and then we're announcing those grant projects. And then throughout the middle of the year, that was when I really tried to focus on who are these grant projects and what are these folks doing with those funds. And then it just kind of became cyclical, right? But intermittently throughout there, we would have events, or we would have different projects that would come up. And I think all I can say is making sure that you're including your staff as a whole in those. Really a one-person job. Like it's you may have a person who really kind of takes the lead on it, or does that outreach or that communication. But what I found in that role for myself learning the nonprofit role, because that was all new to me. Learning how a nonprofit worked was that I counted on my coworkers to help feed to me what they wanted to make sure that we were sharing about our organization. And that was sort of like an ongoing. So I knew I could plan out so much throughout the year, but then on a minute basis, week to week, it was, what do you have coming up next week? What should we share? What's important to these people who follow us? What are some interesting things to help re-engage them if we feel like maybe we're not getting as much, as we have previously, and just making sure that we were kind of there. You just pop up, hi, here we are. This is the thing that we've got going on. But I, as the outreach person, could not myself create that content on my own. I really depended on all of the voices to help filter out what was our message. So hopefully that helped. Any other questions or thoughts?
This was super great. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Really
you're
helpful.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so glad. I'm so glad. And I will make sure that we get the slides. I've got, so Mary knows I made some changes to this in the last 24 hours. So I will send her the most updated version of them. I will make sure to include the best email address that you guys can reach me at. And if you have any questions or anything that you didn't feel comfortable asking, or that you just want to follow up that you think about in the middle of the night tonight, feel free to just send me an email and let me know. And I'm happy to help answer any other questions that you guys might have. And I just want to thank again, Mary and the Montana Media Lab and Park County Community Foundation for allowing me to talk to you all today.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being here. I have a question partly for Mary and partly for the group. This was a wonderful overview and a chance to practice our interviewing. If folks are super excited about this and want to go deeper or learn more things, Mary, I would love to hear from you about some of the other offerings that are available from the Media Lab. And this would also be a great time for folks who are on the Zoom today, if there are other parts of this kind of communication work that you'd like to learn more about, whether or not it's offered by the Media Lab. I would love to hear that either in the chat line, or if you want to speak out loud or follow up an email. We're always wanting to offer trainings that are of interest and relevant to people. So Mary, tell us what else you have on tap.